Before sleep takes hold, the body slows. Breathing deepens. The weight of the day settles into whatever surface holds you. This is the moment when thoughts drift away from schedules and obligations, when the mind becomes open to quiet observation. Let that settling continue now. If the work here brings value to your nights, consider subscribing. And if a particular passage resonates, a like is always appreciated but never expected. The Roman arch begins as nothing more than stones arranged in a curve. Wedge-shaped blocks set in a careful line, leaning against each other until they lock into place with a keystone at the center. The geometry is simple. The effect is permanent. Before this shape became common, buildings relied on straight beams laid across openings. Wood or stone spanning horizontally between two supports. It works for doorways. It works for small windows. But when the span grows wider, when the weight above increases, the beam betrays its limitations. It sags, cracks. It fails at the moment when failure matters most. The arch distributes weight differently. Instead of concentrating pressure at the midpoint, it transfers force outward and downward along the curve. The stones press against each other, tightening under load. The heavier the structure above, the more secure the arch becomes. Gravity becomes an ally rather than a threat. Roman builders did not invent this principle. They found it in earlier civilizations, in Etruscan gates and Mesopotamian drains. But they applied it at scales no one had attempted before. They built arches into bridges spanning rivers, into aqueducts crossing valleys, into gates that stood for centuries. They stacked arches atop arches to create multi-story structures, colosseums and basilicas and market halls, all held together by the same curved geometry that began as a stack of shaped rocks. Walk through any Roman ruin still standing and the arches remain. They frame doorways. They support ceilings. They line the walls of structures that have lost every other feature. The mortar crumbles. The marble veneer peels away. But the arch holds. It holds because the stones no longer rely on adhesive alone. They rely on position, on the way each block presses into its neighbor, on the downward pull of the structure itself. Consider the bridge. A river moves beneath it constantly, wearing at foundations, shifting the bed, testing the joints. The arch above carries traffic, carts and soldiers and merchants and animals, all moving across the same curve day after day. Water expands in winter freezes, contracts in summer heat, and the stone endures. Not because it was chosen perfectly, but because the shape accommodates stress better than any straight line could. In the Roman mind, the arch became more than engineering. It became a way of thinking about permanence, about how structures could be built to last beyond the lives of their builders, about how weight could be managed rather than resisted. The arch does not fight gravity. It accepts gravity and uses it. Walk beneath one on a quiet night. The curve overhead blocks the sky, frames it into a half-circle visible only at the edges. The stones above seem to float, to hang suspended without visible support. But they are not floating. They are pressing together, each stone holding the next in place, the entire assembly locked in tension that looks like peace. Roman bridges still carry traffic in some parts of Europe, not as museum pieces but as working structures, integrated into modern roads, used daily by people who never think about the principles beneath their wheels. The arch became invisible by succeeding too well. It works so quietly that no one notices it working. Before glass windows became common, buildings were darker. They were colder. They let in wind and rain and insects through openings covered only by shutters or cloth or thin slices of translucent stone. The Romans did not invent glass. They found it in Egypt and Syria, learned the techniques of blowing and casting and flattening, then applied those techniques at industrial scale. Glass windows changed what it meant to be indoors. Light entered without cold. The view remained visible while the elements stayed outside. Rooms that once required constant fire for illumination could now rely on the sun. Smoke diminished. I strained less. The interior became a controlled space rather than a compromise between shelter and exposure. In colder provinces, in Britain and Gaul and the German frontier, glass windows made year-round occupation possible in ways that earlier structures could not support. Heat could be trapped. Moisture could be managed. The long, dark winters became survivable without constant fuel consumption. Families gathered in rooms that stayed dry, that admitted light even when snow piled outside. The glass itself was not clear by modern standards. It contained bubbles, distortions, streaks of color from impurities. Light passed through imperfectly, casting shadows and highlights across interior surfaces. But it passed through. That was enough. That changed everything. Roman glassmakers produced panes by casting molten glass into flat sheets or by blowing cylinders that were then split and flattened. The process required skill and patience and fuel. But the result was valuable enough to justify the expense. Villas contained glass windows. Bathhouses contained them. Even some apartment blocks in Roman cities included glass in their upper-story windows, letting light into rooms that would otherwise remain caves. Look through Roman glass and the world appears softened. Edges blur. Colors shift. The glass itself becomes part of the view, a filter between observer and observed. That filter protected more than privacy. It protected health by keeping the interior climate separate from the exterior, by reducing the drafts that carried illness, by letting in light without letting in damp. The Romans understood that shelter is not just about keeping rain off. It is about creating an environment where the body can rest without fighting the elements. Glass windows contributed to that environment more than any military conquest could. Before the codex, information lived on scrolls. Long sheets of papyrus or parchment wound around wooden rods, unrolled to reveal text in sections. To find a passage near the end required unrolling nearly the entire scroll. To compare two passages meant handling two scrolls simultaneously, holding them open with weights or assistance while the text slowly revealed itself. The codex changed this. Pages bound together along one edge, stacked and numbered, accessible by flipping directly to any section. The reader could skip forward and back, could mark a place with a finger, could write notes in margins that corresponded exactly to the text beside them. Romans did not invent the codex outright. They adopted it from earlier experiments, refined the binding techniques, standardized the format until it became the default method for preserving important texts. Legal codes appeared in codices. Medical manuals appeared in them. Military records, administrative documents, religious texts all migrated from scroll to bound pages over the course of several centuries. The difference in survival is measurable. Scrolls deteriorate at the ends first, where handling is most frequent. Information at the beginning and end of a scroll often faded or tore away before the middle could be preserved. Codices distributed where more evenly. Pages at the beginning and end might suffer, but the bulk of the text remained intact. More information survived. More knowledge passed from generation to generation. Think of a scholar in a late Roman library. Morning light through a high window falls on a codex open on a slanted desk. The scholar turns pages slowly, consulting one passage while keeping another visible nearby. Notes accumulate on wax tablets or scraps of parchment. The process is methodical, unhurried, sustainable in ways that scrolling back and forth could never be. That scholar's work, multiplied across hundreds of locations across the empire, created a network of preserved knowledge that outlasted the political structures supporting it. When the western provinces fragmented, when cities shrank and trade routes shifted, the codices remained. They traveled with refugees. They accumulated in monastery libraries. They became the seed stock for later intellectual revivals that would not occur for centuries. The codex did not look dramatic. It looked like pages bound together, like a stack of folded sheets secured along one edge. But that format encoded something essential about how knowledge accumulates. Information organized for retrieval rather than recitation. Knowledge treated as reference rather than performance. The quiet revolution of the bound page. Roman roads are famous. Roman aqueducts are famous. But Roman dams are less discussed, though they changed landscapes as permanently as any other structure. In Spain, in North Africa, in the eastern provinces, Roman engineers built barriers across rivers and valleys to hold water back, to store it for dry months, to release it when needed for irrigation and urban supply. The Proserpina Dam in Spain still stands. Built in the 1st century, it holds back water today as it did 2,000 years ago. Stone blocks fitted without mortar, relying on weight and position to resist the pressure of the reservoir behind them. Water pushes constantly against the face of the dam, seeking weaknesses, testing joints, probing for paths around the edges. The dam responds with mass, with the sheer weight of stone arranged to distribute force downward into the foundation. Before such structures, water management meant hoping for rain. It meant watching rivers rise and fall with the seasons, planting when the ground was wet, starving when it was dry. Dams changed that equation. They allowed surplus. They allowed irrigation networks to extend beyond riverbanks into previously arid land. They allowed cities to grow where water was seasonal rather than constant. The engineering required observation of the landscape. Where did water flow in winter that dried in summer? Where could a barrier be placed to maximize storage while minimizing risk? How high could the wall rise before the pressure became unmanageable? Roman engineers answered these questions through experience, through watching failures as well as successes, through passing knowledge from one project to the next. Consider a valley in North Africa during the dry season. The riverbed is dust. The surrounding fields are brown. But upstream, a Roman dam holds a reservoir of water collected during the winter rains. Sluices open gradually, releasing measured amounts into channels that distribute water across terraced fields. Crops grow where nothing would grow otherwise. People eat who would otherwise migrate or starve. That is not dramatic. It is not the stuff of epic poetry, but it is survival. It is the difference between a region that supports population and a region that empties when the rains fail. Roman dams sometimes failed. They cracked under pressure. They leaked through foundations. They silted up behind their own walls. But the principle persisted because it worked more often than it failed. Water controlled meant water available. Water available meant agriculture stable. Agriculture stable meant society could plan beyond the next rainfall. The military hospital, the valetudinarium, represented a similar shift in thinking. Wounded soldiers had always received care. Someone always bound wounds, set bones, administered herbs and prayers. But organized care, care embedded in the structure of military installations, care with dedicated spaces and standardized tools and designated personnel, that was different. Roman forts contained hospitals as standard components. Excavations at sites across the former empire reveal the same pattern. A rectangular building with rooms arranged around courtyards, with space for surgery, with drainage systems to carry away waste, with storage for instruments and supplies. The design repeated because the need was constant. Inside these buildings, surgeons worked with tools that would be recognizable to later centuries. Scalpels of bronze and steel, forceps for grasping and extracting, bone drills for removing damaged tissue, spatulas for applying salves, needles for suturing wounds. They cleaned injuries with vinegar and boiled water, understanding without germ theory that certain treatments reduced infection. The soldiers who entered these hospitals had a better chance of survival than soldiers in any previous army. Not because Roman medicine was miraculous, but because it was systematic. Wounds were addressed quickly. Infections were treated before they spread. Soldiers recovered and returned to their units, which meant the army retained experienced fighters rather than replacing them constantly. That retention mattered. It meant legions could campaign year after year without depleting their core of veteran soldiers. It meant the empire could project force across vast distances because the human material of that force was conserved rather than expended. The valetudinarium did not look heroic. It looked like a long building with small rooms, with windows placed high for light and ventilation, with floors designed to be cleaned easily. But inside that building, men lived who would have died elsewhere. They lived and returned to their families, to their farms, to their civilian lives after service. The hospital multiplied the human capital of the empire without ever fighting a battle. Roman currency achieved something similar through different means. Standardized coinage, stamped with consistent weights and recognizable imperial imagery, created trust across vast distances. A denarius minted in Rome could buy bread in Gaul, oil in Spain, grain in North Africa. The same coin passed through countless hands, accumulating wear but retaining value because everyone who received it knew it would be accepted elsewhere. Before such standardization, trade required negotiation. Barter systems worked in small communities where everyone knew everyone's needs. But in large empires, in cities where strangers met strangers, currency provided a common language of value. It reduced transaction costs. It allowed markets to function at scales impossible under direct exchange. The Roman economy did not depend entirely on coinage. Much exchange remained local, informal, based on credit and barter. But the presence of reliable currency at the imperial level enabled long-distance trade that would otherwise have been too complicated. Grain moved from Egypt to Rome. Wine moved from Italy to Gaul. Pottery moved from Gaul to Britain, all facilitated by coins that meant the same thing everywhere. When emperors debased the currency, when they reduced silver content to stretch budgets, the system suffered. Inflation followed. Trust eroded. But at its peak, Roman monetary policy created stability across a region that had known only local currencies and their limitations.
The coin in your hand, bearing the emperor's profile, connected you to a network of exchange stretching thousands of miles. That connection had survival value. When local harvests failed, grain could be purchased from elsewhere if currency was accepted. When local industries collapsed, goods could be imported if payment was possible. Currency did not feed anyone directly, but it enabled the movements that kept people fed. The Roman census served similar connective functions. Counting people, assessing property, recording resources, these activities seem bureaucratic, almost trivial compared to building roads or raising legions. But without the census, the empire operated blind. Officials needed to know how many people lived in each province to allocate grain distributions. They needed to know property values to assess taxes. They needed to know population distribution to plan military recruitment. The census provided this information, not perfectly, not completely, but better than any previous system. Enumerators traveled from city to city, recording names and ages and occupations. They noted livestock and landholdings. They asked about citizenship status, about family relationships, about sources of income. The resulting records filled archives, created reference points for administrators, established baselines against which future changes could be measured. Imagine a provincial governor in Gaul, responsible for feeding his province through winter. Without census data, he guesses at how much grain to store. He guesses at how many people might need emergency distributions. With census data, he calculates. He plans. He allocates resources based on numbers rather than intuition. The difference between guessing and calculating is the difference between survival and starvation when margins are thin. Rome understood this. They counted because counting worked. They recorded because records outlasted memory. The Acta Diurna took this principle public. Daily announcements carved on stone or metal, displayed in forums and marketplaces, informing citizens of laws passed, trials concluded, military victories achieved, public events scheduled. The state communicated with the population through permanent displays that anyone could read. Illiteracy limited direct access, but those who could read shared information with those who could not. News spread through the Acta more reliably than through rumor because the Acta carried official versions, authorized accounts, information filtered through administrative channels before reaching the public. In a city the size of Rome, where hundreds of thousands lived in close quarters, information control mattered. Rumors could spark riots. Misinformation could cause panic. The Acta reduced these risks by providing a consistent source, a place where citizens could check what they heard against what was written. The practice spread to provincial cities. Local versions of the Acta appeared in forums across the empire, adapting the Roman model to regional concerns. Colonists in distant provinces read announcements about land distributions, about tax adjustments, about imperial visits. They remained connected to the center through words carved in stone. That connection had survival value, too. When the empire functioned, when information flowed, provinces felt part of something larger than themselves. They contributed to imperial defense, to imperial economy, to imperial culture, because they knew what was happening elsewhere. Isolation breeds suspicion. Connection breeds cooperation. The Acta Diurna, for all its bureaucratic mundanity, created connection. Part 2. Roman aqueducts required maintenance. This fact is easy to overlook when admiring their arches, their long lines marching across landscapes, their persistence through millennia. But maintenance was the difference between temporary infrastructure and permanent systems. The Curator Aquarum held responsibility for Rome's water supply. This official inspected channels, cleared blockages, repaired leaks, enforced regulations against illegal tapping. Crews of workers accompanied him, skilled laborers who understood stone and mortar and the behavior of water under pressure. They climbed into dark passages to remove mineral buildup that reduced flow. They patched cracks before they became breaks. They reinforced sections where foundations settled unevenly. They worked year after year, generation after generation, maintaining what their predecessors built. This maintenance culture extended beyond Rome. Provincial aqueducts received similar attention. Local officials oversaw repairs. Local funds supported crews. The empire treated water infrastructure as a permanent obligation rather than a one-time achievement. The result was reliability. Cities could count on water arriving daily, not just when the system worked. Public fountains flowed continuously. Baths operated on predictable schedules. Latrines flushed with waste carried away by constant streams. The system worked because people worked on it constantly. When maintenance failed, when the empire's administrative capacity declined, aqueducts fell into disrepair. Channels clogged. Cracks widened. Sections collapsed. Cities shrank as water became unreliable. Populations migrated to areas where the system still functioned. The infrastructure decayed slowly, invisibly, until one day the fountain ran dry and no one came to fix it. Roman bridges received similar attention. Stone arches spanning rivers required inspection after floods, after earthquakes, after heavy traffic seasons. Foundations needed reinforcement where water scoured the riverbed. Parapets needed rebuilding where carts struck them. The bridge was never finished. It was always being maintained. This understanding that infrastructure requires continuous attention may be Rome's most important legacy. Not any single structure, but the recognition that structures must be tended. That survival depends not on building well once, but on building well and then maintaining well forever. The lighthouse at Ostia, at Portus, at harbors across the empire, required constant fuel for its beacon. Wood or charcoal burned through the night, consuming resources that had to be transported and stored. Attendants kept the fire going, trimmed the wick if oil lamps were used, ensured the light remained visible through fog and rain. Ships approaching harbor at night watched for that light. It guided them past hazards, into channels, towards safe anchorage. Without it, they risked grounding on shoals, striking rocks, losing cargo and crew within sight of land. The lighthouse did not fight the sea. It illuminated it. It made visible what darkness concealed. The same principle applied to harbor construction itself, to the moles and breakwaters that Roman engineers built to create sheltered water where none existed naturally. At Caesarea Maritima, Herod's harbor on the Judean coast, Roman techniques created an artificial port where geography provided none. Massive concrete blocks, poured underwater using pozzolanic cement that set in contact with seawater, formed breakwaters that tamed the Mediterranean swell. Ships docked safely where previously landing had been impossible. This was not nature improved. It was nature replaced. The Romans built what the coast did not provide, creating infrastructure where none existed, extending the reach of maritime trade into previously inaccessible regions. The cursus publicus, the imperial postal system, connected this infrastructure into networks. Relay stations spaced at intervals along major roads provided fresh horses for official couriers. Messages traveled at speeds previously impossible, covering in days distances that had taken weeks. A governor in Syria could report to Rome and receive instructions within the same campaigning season. A general on the Danube could request reinforcements and see them arrive before winter. Information moved faster than armies, faster than traders, faster than anything except rumor itself. The system required organization. Station masters recorded arrivals and departures. Couriers carried authorizing documents that proved their official status. Horses needed fodder, water, shelter, veterinary care. The entire apparatus depended on consistent management across thousands of miles. When it worked, the empire felt smaller. Provinces remained connected to the center not just by loyalty, but by actual communication, by letters that arrived regularly, by news that reached even distant outposts within days of events in Rome. When it failed, when bandits interrupted routes or officials neglected stations, provinces drifted. Decisions made locally diverged from imperial policy. Information gaps filled with speculation. The center lost touch with the periphery, and the periphery began to function independently. The Romans built redundancy into their systems deliberately. Multiple aqueducts fed Rome so that damage to one did not cut water to the entire city. Multiple grain sources supplied the population so that crop failure in one region could be compensated by imports from another. Multiple roads connected the same destinations so that routes could shift when conditions changed. This redundancy was not accidental. It was planned. The Romans assumed that things would go wrong, that structures would fail, that supply chains would break. They built alternatives into the system from the beginning. Consider the grain supply. Egypt provided much of Rome's wheat, but North Africa also contributed. Sicily contributed. Sardinia contributed. If the Egyptian harvest failed, if the fleet from Alexandria was delayed, other sources filled the gap. The city never depended entirely on any single region. Consider the road network. To travel from Rome to Brundisium, multiple routes existed. The Via Appia was the most famous, but alternatives wound through different valleys, crossed different mountains, offered different options when weather or banditry or political instability closed the main road. This redundancy created resilience. The system absorbed shocks without collapsing. When one component failed, others compensated. The whole continued functioning while the broken part was repaired. Standardization made redundancy possible. When bricks are the same size, they can be used interchangeably in any construction. When road widths follow consistent patterns, vehicles designed for one route can travel any route. When military equipment is standardized, parts from different manufacturers fit the same weapons. The Romans standardized everything they could: brick sizes, tile shapes, pipe diameters, road dimensions, legionary equipment, legal procedures, administrative forms. The result was an empire where components were interchangeable, where systems could be repaired with standard parts, where knowledge gained in one context applied in others. A legionary transferred from the Rhine to the Euphrates carried equipment that worked in both places. A merchant trading between Gaul and Syria used weights and measures that meant the same thing at both ends. A builder trained in Italy could supervise construction in Britain using materials and methods identical to those he knew. Standardization made the empire coherent. It reduced friction. It allowed people and goods and ideas to move across vast distances without constant renegotiation of basic assumptions. The Roman world worked because it was, in fundamental ways, the same world everywhere. This coherence had survival value. When disaster struck, when famine or disease or invasion threatened, standardized systems responded faster than customized ones. Relief could be organized using procedures that worked everywhere. Supplies could be shipped using containers that fit any transport. People could be moved using vehicles that traveled any road. The Romans did not invent every technology they used. They found the arch in earlier cultures. They found glass in Egypt. They found the codex in experiments along the empire's edges. They found cement in local traditions and improved it. But what they did with these discoveries, the way they combined them into systems, the way they maintained and standardized and replicated them, that was uniquely Roman. A villa in Britain received light through glass windows, heat through hypocaust floors, water through lead pipes from local springs. The owner read from a codex, paid taxes in standardized currency, sent messages through the cursus publicus. All these technologies, originating in different times and places, converged in a single life. That convergence was the Roman achievement. Not any single invention, but the network of inventions working together. Not any structure, but the system of structures supporting each other. Not any idea, but the preservation and transmission of ideas across centuries. Walk through the ruins of a Roman city at night. The arches remain. The foundations remain. The lines of streets remain where paving stones have worn smooth under countless feet. Walls stand without roofs. Columns stand without entablatures. The city is empty, but its shape persists. That shape encodes the Roman approach to survival. Build to last. Build redundantly. Build standards that can be replicated anywhere. Maintain what you build. Repair what breaks. Assume that things will go wrong and plan accordingly. The Romans did not expect perfection. They expected problems and built systems that could handle them. That expectation, embedded in every arch and aqueduct and road and codex, may be the quietest and most effective invention of all. In Renaissance Florence, the pursuit of beauty followed different paths. White lead powder created the illusion of flawless skin while poisoning the body beneath it. Women applied this mixture daily, covering faces and necks and shoulders with a smooth white mask that erased freckles and scars and any evidence of outdoor labor. The lead seeped through skin slowly. It accumulated in tissues, in bones, in organs. Over time, it caused headaches and tremors and weakness. It damaged nerves and muscles. It contributed to stillbirths and developmental problems in children. But the powder continued to sell because the ideal persisted. Pale skin meant privilege. It meant the woman did not work in fields, did not labor under the sun, did not share the lot of peasants and servants. Paleness was not just beauty, it was class. It was status made visible on the face. Women who could not achieve this pallor naturally attempted it artificially. They applied ceruse, a mixture of white lead and vinegar, in layers thick enough to hide any underlying color. The result looked smooth from a distance, chalky up close, unnaturally uniform. But in candlelight, in the soft illumination of evening gatherings, it passed for perfection. The cost was paid in health. Skin deteriorated beneath the powder, becoming irritated, inflamed, dependent on the very substance that damaged it. The more the skin suffered, the more powder women applied to cover the damage. A cycle developed that could only end in permanent injury or death. Men sometimes used the powder too, though less extensively. A courtier might lighten his complexion for formal appearances, for portraits, for occasions when looking refined mattered more than looking robust. The same risks applied. The same poisons accumulated. The same trade of health for appearance continued. This was not ignorance. Some women knew the risks. They knew that lead caused problems over time. But the problems were distant, uncertain, while the need for a good marriage was immediate. A pale face could attract a wealthy husband. A wealthy husband could secure a woman's future. The calculation seemed reasonable even when it shortened lives. The high forehead ideal required different sacrifices. Women plucked hairlines to raise them, removing hair strand by strand until the brow appeared larger, more expansive, more like the women in paintings by Leonardo and Botticelli. The process was painful. Hair follicles inflamed. Skin reddened. Infections developed where plucking broke the surface. But the ideal demanded smoothness, a clean line from brow to crown uninterrupted by natural growth. Some women used depilatory creams containing quicklime or arsenic compounds. These burned the skin while removing hair, causing blisters and scars that then required covering with more powder. The cycle of damage and concealment repeated endlessly. Eyebrows sometimes went the same way. Thin brows or no brows at all followed the logic of the high forehead, the smooth expanse of skin that suggested intellectual capacity and spiritual refinement. The face became a blank canvas on which expression was painted rather than naturally occurring. Men's grooming followed similar patterns, though less extreme. A carefully shaped hairline, a smooth brow, a face free of blemishes, these signaled status and cultivation. The Renaissance gentleman managed his appearance as carefully as his estate. The corset of this period was not yet the extreme hourglass of later centuries. It was a structured bodice, stiffened with wood or whalebone or layers of linen, designed to create a smooth line from bust to waist. It compressed the torso, lifted the chest, forced the spine into upright posture. Breathing changed inside a corset. The ribs could not expand fully. The diaphragm worked against pressure. Women learned to breathe shallowly, to move carefully, to avoid any action that might strain the lacing. They wore these garments for hours, for church services that lasted most of the day, for banquets that stretched from afternoon to midnight, for social calls and ceremonial appearances and family gatherings where removing the corset was impossible. Fainting was common. Women collapsed from restricted breathing, from overheated rooms, from the combination of tight lacing and heavy velvet gowns, and the constant effort of maintaining proper posture. Fainting was not always seen as a problem. Sometimes it was interpreted as delicacy, as sensitivity, as evidence of refined nature. Doctors warned occasionally. Medical texts noted that excessive tightness could damage internal organs, could displace the womb, could cause long-term health problems. But fashion ignored medicine then, as it often does now. The weight of clothing added to the strain. Velvet gowns weighed several kilograms. Embroidered overdresses added more. Jewelry, gold chains, gemstones, heavy earrings, all contributed to the load carried by the body throughout social events. Women wore these garments in summer heat and winter cold, in crowded rooms and drafty corridors. They adapted to the weight, learned to move within its constraints, developed techniques for managing the layers without appearing to struggle. The sleeves alone could be problematic. Exaggerated sleeves, puffed and slashed and layered, caught on doorways, brushed through candle flames, collected dust from every surface they touched. Fire was a constant danger. One spark on velvet, one flame touching silk, and the entire garment could ignite. Sumptuary laws attempted to regulate this display. Governments in Italian city-states passed rules limiting certain fabrics and colors to specific social classes. Only nobles could wear crimson. Only merchants could wear certain cuts. The laws attempted to maintain visible hierarchy, to ensure that clothing announced rank accurately. But the laws could not keep pace with fashion. Wealthy commoners found ways to imitate noble dress. Noble women pushed boundaries to display status through fabric and ornament. The competition continued regardless of regulation. Hair coloring introduced chemical risks beyond those of powder. Venetian women particularly sought blonde hair, the golden shade associated with angels and goddesses in Renaissance art. They applied mixtures containing alum and sulfur and mercury compounds, then sat for hours in direct sunlight to activate the bleach. The sun did its work. Hair lightened gradually, turning from brown to gold over repeated treatments. But the chemicals damaged hair structure, leaving it brittle and prone to breakage. Scalps burned. Skin blistered. Mercury absorbed through the skin accumulated in tissues and caused neurological damage over time. Wide-brimmed hats with open tops protected faces from tanning while exposing hair to sun. Women sat on rooftops and terraces, hair spread across the hat's crown, waiting for chemistry and sunlight to transform them. The process could take days. It could take weeks. But the result was worth the effort because blonde hair was rare and prized. The ideal came partly from paintings, partly from poetry, partly from classical imagery of goddesses with golden hair. It came also from Northern European beauty standards that influenced Italian courts through trade and diplomacy. Whatever the source, the demand was real enough to justify significant risk. Men sometimes lightened hair too, though usually not with the same intensity. A nobleman might add golden highlights to his hair, might seek the sun-kissed look that suggested youth and vitality. The chemicals still damaged, still burned, still poisoned slowly over time. Beauty patches offered a different approach to imperfection. Small pieces of silk or velvet cut into decorative shapes, circles and stars and crescents and hearts, applied to the face to cover scars and blemishes. The patches concealed while drawing attention. A scar covered by a star became a focal point. A blemish hidden by a crescent became an ornament. The flaw was not erased but transformed, made intentional, made part of a visual language that others could read. Placement mattered. A patch near the mouth suggested flirtation. One near the eye implied mystery. One on the cheek indicated general availability for conversation. Women communicated through these small signals, through the language of beauty spots applied each morning and removed each night. Adhesives irritated skin. Animal glues and plant resins caused inflammation, which then required more patches to cover. The cycle repeated daily, skin deteriorating slowly under the constant application and removal of adhesive. But the patches offered control. They allowed women to decide what would be seen and what would remain hidden. They turned the face into a composition, an arrangement of features and ornaments that could be adjusted according to mood or occasion. Rouge added color to cheeks made pale by crushed cochineal insects produced rich red pigment that, mixed with fats or oils, could be dabbed onto cheeks and lips to simulate natural flush. The goal was subtlety, a hint of color, a suggestion of vitality beneath the deliberate pallor. Too much rouge looked theatrical, common, like women of lower classes who used makeup more boldly. Too little looked sickly, as if the powder had erased all evidence of life. Women balanced carefully between these extremes. They applied rouge in daylight, checking the effect in mirrors of polished metal or glass. They adjusted intensity according to the occasion, more color for evening events, less for daytime appearances. The flush suggested youth, health, fertility. It suggested that beneath the artificial surface, real life continued. It reassured observers that the woman was not actually fading into marble perfection, but remained warm and alive. Bloodletting sometimes contributed to this effect, though unintentionally. Medical theory held that health depended on balancing bodily fluids, on maintaining proper ratios of blood and phlegm and bile. Bloodletting was prescribed for various conditions, including those affecting complexion. A woman might lose blood to treat a fever, then find her cheeks paler afterward. She might apply more rouge to compensate. The cycle of treatment and cosmetic response continued without clear separation between medicine and beauty. Physicians performed bloodletting in homes, in shops, in dedicated rooms where patients came for treatment. They used lancets and cups, drawing measured amounts according to established protocols. The practice was common enough that most adults experienced it at some point in their lives. The connection between blood loss and complexion was not lost on women. Some requested bloodletting specifically to achieve paler skin, though physicians usually resisted such requests. The line between medical treatment and cosmetic procedure blurred in practice. Part 3. Constantinople in the spring of 1453 held fewer people than it once had. The great city, founded by Constantine centuries earlier as the New Rome, had shrunk within its walls. Whole neighborhoods stood empty where once populations crowded. Gardens grew where houses had stood. The population that remained, perhaps 50,000 souls, waited behind walls that had never been breached. The Theodosian walls protected the land approach. Triple layers of fortifications, moats and outer walls and inner walls, built in the 5th century and maintained ever since. They had stopped Huns and Avars and Persians and Arabs. They had saved the city time after time when enemies surrounded it. The Ottoman army camped outside those walls numbered perhaps 80,000, maybe more. Counting was difficult across such a host. Tents spread across the plain, organized by unit, by region, by function. Campfires burned at night in patterns that from the walls looked like stars reflected on earth. Mehmed II was 21 years old. He had ruled for 2 years since his father's death, had consolidated power, had prepared for this moment. The conquest of Constantinople would make him not just Sultan but Caesar, heir to Rome itself. He believed this with the certainty of youth and ambition. His army included janissaries, elite infantry recruited from Christian subjects, converted to Islam, trained from childhood for military service. They were the best soldiers in Europe, disciplined and loyal and armed with firearms that other armies still viewed with suspicion. The artillery came from Hungarian and German founders who cast guns for whoever paid. The largest bombard required 60 oxen to move and 200 men to position. Its stone balls weighed over 500 kilograms each. When it fired, the sound carried for miles, and the impact shook walls built to withstand any siege engine. Inside the city, Emperor Constantine XI Palaiologos prepared for what he knew might be the end. He had ruled for 4 years, had sought help from Western Europe, had received promises and small contingents, but no mass relief force. The Venetians and Genoese in the city contributed ships and soldiers, but their numbers were limited. The emperor walked the walls daily. He inspected repairs, spoke with commanders, showed himself to defenders who needed to see their leader present. He knew the odds. He knew the walls would hold only as long as men held them. He knew that behind him, the city's churches held liturgies day and night, praying for deliverance. The great chain across the Golden Horn protected the harbor side. Heavy iron links floating on wooden barrels, stretching from the city walls to the Genoese district of Galata across the water. Ottoman ships could not pass it. The harbor remained open to Byzantine and Allied vessels, a lifeline for supplies and communication. Mehmed studied this obstacle and planned around it. He could not break the chain with naval force alone. His ships could not overpower the chain's defenders. So, he would move his ships over land instead. The idea seemed impossible. Ships weighed tons, required water to float, could not simply be dragged across hills. But Ottoman engineers prepared a track of grease logs, a wooden road from the Bosporus to the Golden Horn behind the chain. Under cover of darkness, they moved the ships. Dozens of vessels, galleys and transports, hauled by teams of men and oxen, sliding across the greased timbers, passing over the hill behind Galata, descending to the water inside the harbor. When morning came, Byzantine defenders saw Ottoman ships floating where no Ottoman ships should be. The chain had been bypassed. The harbor was no longer safe. Panic spread through the city as quickly as the news. Now the defenders faced threats on both sides. Land walls under bombardment, harbor walls now vulnerable to attack from within. The force they could commit to any section diminished. The Ottomans could choose where to strike, could probe weak points, could keep the defenders guessing. The cannons continued firing. The largest bombard could manage only a few shots per day. It overheated, cracked, required cooling and repair between firings. But each shot damaged the walls a little more. Cracks widened. Sections collapsed. Defenders filled gaps with rubble and timber, working through nights to repair what daylight destroyed. Orban, the Hungarian engineer who built the Great Bombard, had offered his services to Constantine first. But the emperor could not afford his price, could not match the resources Mehmed commanded. So Orban built for the Ottomans instead, his cannons now destroying the walls he might have helped defend. The psychological impact may have mattered more than the physical. Walls that had stood for 1,000 years, that generations had believed invincible, now crumbled under artillery. Faith in the walls meant faith in survival. As the walls cracked, so did certainty. Inside the city, religious processions wound through streets. Icons were carried along the walls, displayed to bless defenders. Priests led liturgies in churches packed with worshippers who had nowhere else to turn. The Virgin Mary had saved the city before. Perhaps she would save it again. But some remembered prophecies. Some recalled words that the city would fall when the emperor shared the name of the city's founder. Constantine, 11th of that name, defending the city of the first Constantine. Coincidence or fate, it weighed on minds as the siege continued. On the night before the final assault, the emperor, the great church, largest in Christendom for nearly 1,000 years, filled with candles and incense and voices raised in prayer. Orthodox and Catholic worshippers gathered together, their theological disputes set aside in the face of common threat. The emperor received communion. He asked forgiveness of those present, as custom required. He left the church and returned to the walls, knowing he would not enter it again. In the Ottoman camp, Mehmed prepared his troops. He promised them the wealth of the city, 3 days of plunder according to tradition. The soldiers prepared for assault, sharpened weapons, said prayers, waited for the signal. Before dawn on May 29th, the attack began. first waves of irregular troops, the least valuable soldiers, sent to tire defenders and test weak points. They came with ladders and grappling hooks, with axes and swords, with the knowledge that most would die, but that their deaths would serve the assault. The defenders beat them back. Stones and arrows and Greek fire drove the irregulars from the walls. But the defenders tired, and more attackers waited behind. Second wave Anatolian troops, better equipped, better trained, pressed the assault where the first wave had failed. They reached the walls in places, planted ladders, climbed toward defenders who struck them down. Fighting continued through morning, brutal and exhausting. Finally, the Janissaries advanced. Mehmed held them back until the moment when defenders showed signs of weakness. Then he committed his best troops, fresh and disciplined and determined. The critical point came near the gate of St. Romanus, where cannon fire had done most damage. Giovanni Giustiniani, the Genoese commander leading defense there, was wounded. He left the walls to seek treatment. In his absence, coordination faltered. Some defenders saw the withdrawal and assumed worse. They pulled back. Ottoman soldiers exploited the gap, reached the top of the wall, raised a banner. Once the banner appeared, morale collapsed. Defenders who had fought for hours, who had held through wave after wave, now saw that the wall was breached. Constantine is said to have removed his imperial insignia and charged into the fighting as an ordinary soldier. He was not seen again. His body was never identified among the dead. The last Roman emperor vanished into smoke and chaos. By mid-morning, the city was lost. Ottoman soldiers poured through breaches and gates, spreading through streets, beginning the 3 days of plunder Mehmed had promised. Churches were stripped. Houses were entered. Citizens were taken for ransom or enslavement. Some civilians reached the harbor, found ships still able to sail, escaped to Greek territories still free. Others hid in buildings, hoping to survive the initial violence. Many died, killed in the chaos of conquest. Mehmed entered the city later that day. He rode through streets lined with dead and destroyed, past buildings still burning, past soldiers still looting. He made his way to Hagia Sophia, dismounted, entered the church that had held Christian worship hours before. According to accounts, he ordered a muezzin to climb the pulpit and recite the call to prayer. The great church became a mosque. The transformation was immediate and symbolic. Christendom's greatest cathedral now belonged to Islam. But Mehmed did not destroy the city. He did not level it as conquerors sometimes did. He saw its value, its location, its potential as capital of his growing empire. He began immediately to repopulate it, to repair damage, to establish administration. He invited survivors to return. He offered security to those who would resettle. He brought in Muslim families from conquered territories, Jewish families from other regions, Christian families willing to accept Ottoman rule. The city would not die. It would transform. The name changed gradually. Constantinople became Istanbul, though both names persisted for centuries. Greek speakers continued using the old name. Turks used the new. The city remained a crossroads, a meeting place of cultures and faiths. In the months after conquest, refugees carried more than their lives to the west. They carried books, manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle, of Sophocles and Euripides, of medical texts and mathematical treatises and philosophical commentaries. Works preserved in Byzantine libraries for centuries, copied and recopied by generations of scribes. These manuscripts reached Italy, where Renaissance scholarship was already reviving classical learning. Greek scholars fleeing the fall brought language skills and texts that accelerated this revival. Florentines and Venetians who had studied Latin now gained access to Greek originals. Plato's works in particular influenced Renaissance thought. His dialogues, available now in complete form, shaped philosophy and politics and art. The Platonic Academy in Florence, founded after the fall, became a center of this revival. Historians debate how decisive this influx was. The Renaissance had begun before 1453. Italian scholars had already recovered many classical texts, but the arrival of Greek refugees and their libraries certainly intensified the movement, expanded its sources, deepened its foundations. Europe reacted to the fall with alarm. The city had stood for so long, had seemed so permanent, that its loss shocked courts and churches across the continent. Calls for crusade sounded, though no crusade materialized. Fear of Ottoman expansion spread. Venice and Genoa, commercial powers with trading interests in the east, recalculated their positions. They had lost access to Black Sea ports, had seen their merchants killed or captured, had to negotiate new terms with the Ottoman victors. The papacy urged action, but European powers remained divided. France and England still recovering from their long war. German princes distracted by internal conflicts. The crusading impulse that had once united Europe now scattered among competing interests. Trade routes shifted. The Ottomans controlled the eastern Mediterranean more completely than the Byzantines ever had. European merchants paid duties, accepted Ottoman oversight, adapted to new conditions. Some sought alternative routes to Asian goods, routes that avoided Ottoman territory. Within decades, ships would sail west and south, seeking sea passages to India and China. The age of exploration drew energy partly from the closing of traditional routes. Constantinople's fall contributed to Europe's outward turn. The Holy Roman Empire in Central Europe claimed continuity with ancient Rome. Its emperors styled themselves successors to the Caesars. But after 1453, the claim seemed thinner. The Eastern Empire, the direct continuation of Roman governance, had ended. Only the idea remained. In Russia, the concept of Moscow as Third Rome emerged. After Constantinople fell, some argued that Moscow now carried the Orthodox Christian inheritance, that Russian Tsars were heirs to Byzantine emperors. This idea shaped Russian identity for centuries. The fall did not end history. It shifted it. The medieval world, with its assumptions about Christian unity and imperial continuity, gave way to early modern realities. Nation-states rose. Global exploration expanded. Gunpowder empires competed for territory. Constantine Palaiologos died on the walls, or near them. His body never found, his grave unknown. The last Roman emperor disappeared into the smoke of a city that had outlasted its western counterpart by nearly 1,000 years. Mehmed the Conqueror added Caesar to his titles. He claimed succession from Rome, not destruction of it. In his mind, conquest transferred authority. The empire continued under new management. Hagia Sophia remained a mosque until the 20th century, when it became a museum. In recent years, it has become a mosque again. The building endures, adapted to each age's purposes, outlasting the empires that built and converted and reconverted it. The walls still stand in places. Sections repaired and rebuilt over centuries, some stones original, others replacements. They no longer defend anything. They frame the city's edges, mark where the old city ended and the new began. Part 4. Jamestown in 1607 was not what settlers expected. They had crossed the Atlantic expecting gold, expecting easy wealth, expecting to find what Spain had found further south. Instead, they found swamps, mosquitoes, water that made them sick, and people who already lived there. The Virginia Company of London organized the expedition as a business venture. Investors purchased shares expecting returns. Settlers signed on expecting opportunity. No one expected to spend months building fortifications and planting crops and dying of diseases they had never encountered. The site they chose on the James River seemed strategic. Inland enough to avoid Spanish naval attack, deep enough for ships to anchor close to shore, high enough to overlook approaches. But the ground was swampy, the water brackish, the mosquitoes constant carriers of malaria and other fevers. They built a triangular fort, wooden palisades with watchtowers at corners. Inside, they constructed storehouses, a church, living quarters. The structures were rough, built from green timber that warped as it dried. Roofs leaked, walls let in wind, but the fort provided defense against whatever might come. Relations with the Powhatan Confederacy began cautiously. The English needed food. The Powhatan people assessed the newcomers, traded corn for copper and beads, watched to see what these pale strangers intended. John Smith emerged early as a leader who understood survival required work. He imposed discipline, required everyone to contribute, famously declared that those who would not work would not eat. This was not popular with gentlemen who had never labored, but it kept the colony alive through early months. Smith also explored, mapped, traded with indigenous communities. He learned some of their language, understood something of their politics, recognized that the colony depended on their goodwill for food until English crops could sustain it. The winter after arrival killed half the colonists. Disease, malnutrition, contaminated water, all combined to reduce the original 104 settlers to 38 survivors by spring. Ships from England brought new settlers, but not enough supplies. The cycle repeated. Pocahontas appears in Smith's accounts as the daughter of Powhatan who intervened to save his life when he was captured. Historians debate the story. Some think it was a ritual adoption Smith misinterpreted. Others question whether it happened at all. But Pocahontas became an intermediary, a figure who moved between worlds, who helped maintain communication and trade through early years. She later married John Rolfe, traveled to England, became a symbol of peaceful relations. She died there, buried on English soil, never returning to the land of her birth. The starving time came in 1609 to 1610. New settlers had arrived, increasing population to about 500, but supplies remained inadequate. Relations with Powhatan deteriorated. Trade for corn stopped. The fort became a prison as indigenous warriors prevented foraging beyond the palisade. People ate what they could find. Horses first, then dogs, then rats. They boiled leather, ate roots, consumed anything that might provide nourishment. Archaeological evidence suggests some resorted to cannibalism, eating the dead to survive. By spring, only about 60 remained alive. When ships arrived from England, the survivors prepared to abandon the settlement. They boarded, sailed downriver, ready to leave Jamestown to ruin. They met a new fleet coming upriver. Lord de la Warr brought supplies, reinforcements, orders to maintain the colony. The survivors returned to the fort. Jamestown continued. Tobacco changed everything. John Rolfe experimented with Caribbean seeds, grew a variety that English smokers preferred to the harsh native tobacco. Demand grew rapidly. What had been a struggling outpost became a plantation colony. Tobacco required land. The English expanded beyond the fort, cleared forests, planted fields. They needed workers to tend the crop. Indentured servants came from England, trading years of labor for passage to America. They worked the fields, survived if they could, gained freedom after their terms ended. The first Africans arrived in 1619. A Dutch ship traded captured people for supplies. Their status is unclear from surviving records. Some may have been treated as servants, others as slaves. Over following decades, the institution hardened into race-based chattel slavery that would define Virginia's economy and society. The House of Burgesses also began in 1619. Representatives from settlements across Virginia met in Jamestown's church to make laws, levy taxes, address local concerns. The Virginia Company authorized this assembly to encourage settlement, to give colonists stake in governance. The Burgesses were property-owning men. They represented only certain interests. But the principle that colonists should participate in their own government took root. Generations later, that principle would fuel arguments against British control. Indigenous resistance continued. In 1622, Opechancanough led coordinated attacks across English settlements. Nearly a third of the colony's population died in a single day. Jamestown survived, warned just in time, but outlying plantations were destroyed. The English response was brutal. They burned villages, destroyed crops, killed without distinction. The conflict continued for decades, intensifying with another uprising in 1644 that ended with Opechancanogh's capture and death. By then, Virginia had become a royal colony. The Virginia Company's charter was revoked in 1624 after years of mismanagement and failure to generate promised returns. The Crown took direct control, appointed governors, integrated the colony into imperial administration. Jamestown remained capital through these changes. The fort expanded, added brick buildings, grew into a town. Government met there. Courts convened there. Merchants traded there. The settlement that had nearly died so many times now anchored English America. Fires damaged the town repeatedly. Disease never stopped killing. But the colony survived because tobacco paid, because land attracted settlers, because the English crown now had stake in its success. In 1699, the capital moved to Williamsburg. Jamestown's role as political center ended. The town shrank, became a rural outpost, eventually a ruin. What remained was excavated by archaeologists centuries later, revealing the bones of the original fort, the traces of those first desperate years. The settlers who arrived in 1607 expected something different. They expected gold. They found mud. They expected quick wealth. They found slow death. They expected to conquer. They found they needed help to survive. But they stayed. Or some of them stayed. Enough stayed that the colony endured through starving time and war and disease and fire. Enough stayed that more came after them, drawn by tobacco profits and land grants and the possibility of something better than what they left. Jamestown's legacy is mixed. It established English presence in North America, created patterns of representative government, built economy on tobacco that depended on enslaved labor. It displaced indigenous people, destroyed their communities, claimed their land as English property. The settlers who landed there did not intend to found a nation. They intended to make money for investors. But intention matters less than outcome. What grew from that swampy fort became something none of them could have predicted. Walk through the reconstructed fort today. See the palisades, the church, the storehouses. Imagine the first winter, the sickness, the desperation. Then imagine tobacco ships loading at the wharf, bound for England with cargo that would make someone rich. The contradictions were present from the beginning. Freedom and slavery. Survival and destruction. Cooperation and conflict. All built into the foundation of a colony that became a state that became part of a nation. Jamestown teaches that survival is not always noble. Sometimes it requires compromise, exploitation, violence. Sometimes it requires accepting help from those you will later displace. Sometimes it requires doing what is necessary rather than what is right. The settlers did what they did. The indigenous people did what they did. The enslaved Africans endured what they endured. History records all of it, the good and the bad, the choices and the consequences. From that complexity, the United States eventually emerged. Not because Jamestown was destined to succeed, but because enough people at enough moments made enough decisions that the colony continued. Contingency and chance played their parts. So did determination and greed and hope and fear. The fort is gone now except where archaeologists have reconstructed it. The church has been rebuilt multiple times. The graves of early settlers lie scattered, some marked, most forgotten. The river still flows past, brown and wide, carrying ships that no longer carry tobacco. Night settles over the site. The reconstructed buildings stand empty. The interpretive signs describe what happened here. Visitors have gone home. The place returns to quiet, to the sound of water moving, to the memory of those who came and stayed and died and survived. There is no moral to extract from this. No simple lesson that explains 4 centuries. Only the awareness that what began here shaped what came after, in ways both intended and accidental, in ways that continue to matter. The colonists who survived the starving time did not know they were founding a nation. They knew they were hungry. They knew they were scared. They knew they wanted to live. That was enough. That had to be enough. And because they lived, others came. And because others came, settlements spread. And because settlements spread, the land changed, the people changed, the possibilities changed. History moves through such small decisions, such narrow survivals, such ordinary days when nothing seems inevitable. The night deepens. The river continues. The fort waits for morning. And somewhere, someone who has listened through all of this drifts toward sleep, carried by words that require nothing in return. That is enough. That has to be enough. The land around Jamestown held memories older than the English settlement. Fields that became tobacco plantations had been cleared centuries before by people who understood the soil, who planted corn and beans and squash together so that each plant supported the others. They burned undergrowth to improve hunting, managed forests for game, moved settlements seasonally to follow resources. The English saw wilderness. They saw empty land waiting for improvement. They did not see what had been there for thousands of years. The Powhatan Confederacy consisted of perhaps 30 tribes bound by alliance and kinship. They spoke related Algonquian languages, traded among themselves, gathered for ceremonies, fought occasionally with each other and with enemies beyond the Confederacy. Powhatan himself, also known as Wahunsenka, inherited leadership of several tribes and expanded his influence through diplomacy and war until he controlled most of the coastal plain. When the English arrived, Powhatan watched from a distance. He sent emissaries, traded corn, assessed these newcomers who built wooden forts and carried weapons that fired with smoke and thunder. He understood they were not like previous visitors, not like the Spanish who had explored these coasts decades before. These English built permanent structures. They brought women in later voyages. They intended to stay. The English did not understand Powhatan politics. They negotiated with individual chiefs, made agreements that conflicted with Confederacy policy, assumed that treaties meant what they said without understanding that Powhatan diplomacy operated through different assumptions. Misunderstand accumulated. Trade relations soured. Violence became more common. John Smith tried to explain these dynamics to his fellow colonists. He had traveled, traded, learned some of the language. He understood that the colony depended on indigenous goodwill and that goodwill depended on respect and reciprocity. But Smith was not always present. He was injured, returned to England, replaced by leaders who understood less and assumed more. Pocahontas moved between these worlds. She visited the fort as a child, played with boys there, learned some English. She carried messages between her father and the colonists. She warned of planned attacks according to some accounts. She became a figure of curiosity and affection, a bridge across cultural distance. That bridge collapsed when English traders captured her, held her for ransom, used her to negotiate peace. During her captivity, She converted to Christianity, took the name Rebecca, married John Rolfe. The marriage created temporary peace, a pause in the violence that had already killed many on both sides. She sailed to England with Rolfe and their young son. London society received her with fascination. She attended plays, met the king and queen, sat for portraits in English dress. She was presented as evidence of colonial success, of the possibility that indigenous people could be civilized and converted. She died there, at about 21 years old, buried in a churchyard in Gravesend. Her son survived, returned to Virginia as a child, grew up among his father's people. Descendants of that marriage continue today, carrying DNA and memory of the woman who moved between worlds. After Pocahontas died, after Powhatan died, after John Rolfe died, the peace died too. Opechancanough, Powhatan's brother, had never trusted the English. He watched them spread, clear land, plant tobacco, push settlements deeper into territory the Confederacy had always controlled. He planned the attacks that came in 1622 and again in 1644, attempts to push the English back into the sea. The attacks failed. They killed many colonists, but not enough. The English retaliated with greater force, with tactics designed to destroy indigenous capacity for resistance. They targeted villages, burned crops, killed women and children, made war on entire populations rather than just warriors. By the time Opechancanough was captured in 1644, he was perhaps 90 years old, blind, carried on a litter. A soldier shot him in the back while he was held prisoner. The war continued without him, but the Confederacy never recovered its power. Tribes submitted to English authority, accepted reservation lands, became subjects rather than allies. The land that had supported them for millennia became tobacco fields. The forests they had managed became plantations. The rivers they had fished became boundaries between English properties. Their presence shrank to remnants, to small communities scattered across a landscape increasingly controlled by others. Some tribes survived. The Pamunkey and Mattaponi still exist today, maintaining continuous presence in Virginia since before the English arrived. They hold reservations established by colonial treaties, still fish the rivers their ancestors fished, still remember what others have forgotten. But most were displaced, absorbed, erased from the land they had always known. Their names survive on maps as rivers and counties. Powhatan and Accomack and Rappahannock place names that mark what was lost. The people behind those names became ghosts in the landscape they once owned. Jamestown's success required this displacement. The colony could not expand without land. The land could not be taken without conflict. The conflict could not be won without destroying the people who lived there. This is not judgment. It is observation. It is what happened, recorded in documents and bones, and the shape of the land itself. The English who survived the starving time, who planted tobacco and built plantations, did not think of themselves as destroyers. They thought of themselves as settlers, as farmers, as people making new lives in a new world. They saw empty land because they could not see what filled it. They saw wilderness because they could not recognize civilization in forms different from their own. This blindness was not unique to them. It is human, this inability to see what we do not expect. But it had consequences. It changed the continent. It changed the people who lived there and the people who came after. The changes continue still, working themselves out through generations that inherit the results of choices made long ago. The James River flows past what was Jamestown, past what was Powhatan territory, past what is now none of those things. Water moves always, carrying sediment and memory, depositing both where the current slows. The river does not care about borders or ownership. It only flows. In the church at Jamestown, reconstructed on the site of the original, services are held sometimes. Tourists visit, read the markers, take photographs. The graves around the church hold people whose names are recorded and people whose names are lost. The dead lie in ground that was once contested, then claimed, then settled, then abandoned, then remembered. Night covers all of it. The river reflects stars. The wind moves through trees planted long after the first settlers arrived. The dead are quiet. The living sleep. The story continues without ending because stories do not end. They only pause, waiting for someone to continue them. The tobacco economy that saved Jamestown also transformed it. Plantations spread along rivers, each with its own wharf for shipping hogsheads of cured leaf directly to ocean-going vessels. The need for labor grew constantly. Indentured servants came from England, Ireland, Scotland, Germany, trading years of work for passage and freedom dues at the end of their terms. These servants worked the fields alongside their masters, ate the same food, slept in similar quarters. They could be bought and sold during their terms, their contracts transferred like property. But they retained legal rights, could appeal to courts, could expect freedom when their time was served. Many became landowners themselves, establishing farms on the edges of settled areas. The shift from servants to slaves happened gradually. The first Africans arrived in 1619, but their status was not immediately fixed. Some became free, owned property, married, lived as other colonists lived. But over decades, laws changed. Africans and their children became property, bought and sold for life, their labor extracted without end. The reasons were economic. Slaves served for life, not just for terms. Their children were also slaves, increasing the workforce without additional purchase. The investment cost more initially, but paid returns over longer periods. Planters who could afford slaves found them more profitable than servants whose contracts eventually expired. The reasons were also racial. English colonists distinguished themselves from Africans by appearance, by culture, by religion. They developed ideologies that justified permanent servitude, that claimed Africans were naturally suited to labor under tropical conditions, that their enslavement was consistent with divine will. These justifications hardened over time into systems of belief that outlasted the economic arrangements they supported. By the late 17th century, Virginia's labor force was predominantly enslaved. Africans captured in wars, purchased from traders, transported across the Atlantic in conditions that killed many before arrival. They worked tobacco fields from dawn to dusk, lived in quarters provided by planters, formed families that could be broken by sale at any moment. Some resisted. They ran away, hid in forests, formed communities of Maroons beyond planter control. They rebelled when possible, though rebellions were rare and always suppressed. They maintained cultural practices, languages, religions, passing what they could to children who would never know Africa. Most endured. They worked, survived, raised families, died. Their labor made Virginia rich, made tobacco profitable, made possible the expansion of English settlement across the continent. The wealth they created built houses, bought land, funded education, established institutions that would outlast slavery itself. The contradictions were present from the beginning. The same colony that established representative government also established hereditary bondage. The same men who spoke of liberty for themselves owned other human beings. The same economy that generated prosperity for some generated suffering for others. These contradictions did not resolve. They deepened. They became embedded in the structure of American society, in laws and customs and assumptions that persisted through centuries. The plantation system that began at Jamestown shaped the South, shaped the nation, shaped conflicts that would eventually tear the country apart. But in the early years, none of that was visible. Planters worried about tobacco prices, about labor costs, about Indian attacks, about disease. They lived in wooden houses, ate local food. died young by modern standards. They did not see themselves as building a civilization. They saw themselves as trying to survive. Survival required labor. Labor required workers. Workers required coercion, when free people would not work for wages they could earn on their own land. The logic was internal to the system, driven by forces planters did not fully understand and could not control. The tobacco market fluctuated. Prices rose and fell with European demand, with competition from other colonies, with wars that disrupted shipping. Planters who borrowed to expand production could lose everything when prices dropped. Land that had been valuable became worthless. Families that had been wealthy became poor. Some planters adapted. They diversified crops, grew food for local markets, raised livestock, manufactured goods for sale. They reduced dependence on tobacco, spread risk across multiple enterprises. These operations survived better through downturns, maintained their workforce, held their land. Others failed. They sold out to creditors, moved west to start again on cheaper land, disappeared from records. Their plantations were absorbed by neighbors, consolidated into larger holdings, worked by the same enslaved people under new owners. The landscape changed. Forests that had covered the coastal plain gave way to fields, then to abandoned fields when tobacco exhausted the soil, then to new growth that was not quite forest again. Planters moved west, clearing new land, leaving old fields to recover. The pattern repeated across generations, the frontier moving always toward the mountains. The people who had lived there before watched this expansion from shrinking territories. They saw their hunting grounds become farms, their villages become plantations, their rivers become boundaries between English properties. They adapted when they could, resisted when they could not, retreated when resistance failed. By the time the colonial capital moved to Williamsburg in 1699, Jamestown's role had changed. The town continued as a port, as a trading center, as a place where planters gathered to conduct business. But government was elsewhere. The focus had shifted. The original settlement became one among many rather than the center of everything. Fires damaged the town repeatedly. Each time, some buildings were rebuilt, others abandoned. The population declined. The fort that had protected early settlers became unnecessary as English control spread. The church that had held the first General Assembly became a parish church among others. By the mid-18th century, Jamestown was a rural backwater. A few families lived there, farmed the land, maintained the church. Visitors noted the ruins of earlier structures, the remains of the brick church tower, the graves of early settlers scattered through the churchyard. The river continued its work. It eroded the shore, undercut foundations, carried away soil that had once supported buildings. The island where the original fort stood became a peninsula, then an island again as channels shifted. The site of the first permanent English settlement in North America slowly returned to marsh and woodland. Archaeologists began excavating in the 20th century. They found the remains of the fort, the outlines of buildings, artifacts that told stories documents could not. They found evidence of the starving time, of cannibalism, of the desperate measures colonists took to survive. They found traces of indigenous presence predating English arrival, layers of occupation stretching back thousands of years. The site became a national park, then a historic preservation project, then a tourist attraction. Reconstructions were built. Interpretive signs were installed. Visitors came to see where America began, to walk the ground where history happened. But the ground itself held more than history. It held bones, seeds, pollen grains, microscopic evidence of what grew there, what people ate, what diseases they carried. It held the physical remains of choices made and consequences suffered. It held what the documents could not record. Knighted Jamestown now is quiet. The reconstructed fort is empty. The church is dark. The interpretive signs are unread. The river moves past, brown and wide, carrying whatever it carries. The dead lie in graves marked and unmarked, their bones mixing with soil that was once their world. The story does not end because the story cannot end. It continues in the descendants of those who survived, in the land that still bears marks of colonial use, in the institutions that grew from Jamestown's founding. The past is not past. It is present in ways we do not always recognize. A visitor standing at the river's edge at night might feel the weight of that presence, might sense that the ground holds more than dirt and stone, might understand that what happened here shaped what came after in ways too numerous to count. But the feeling passes. The river flows. The night continues. The visitor returns to wherever they came from. Jamestown remains, waiting for morning, waiting for the next visitors, waiting for whatever comes next. Part 6. The tobacco economy required infrastructure. Plantations needed wharves for shipping, warehouses for storage, roads for moving hogsheads to ports. The colonial government built what it could, but most infrastructure was private, built by planters for their own use and shared with neighbors when convenient. Rolling roads carried tobacco to inspection stations where quality was checked before export. Hogsheads, large barrels filled with cured leaf, were rolled along these paths, dragged by horses or oxen, sometimes for miles. The roads were rough, muddy in wet weather, dusty and dry. Tobacco could be damaged during transport, reducing its value. Inspection stations became gathering places. Planters met there, discussed prices, shared news from England, negotiated deals. Merchants visited to buy leaf directly from growers. Agents from British firms established contacts, extended credit, arranged shipping. The credit system bound planters to merchants. Planters bought goods on credit during the year, paid with tobacco at harvest. If prices were low, they went deeper into debt. If prices were high, they reduced what they owed. But they rarely escaped debt entirely. The system kept them dependent on merchants who controlled access to British markets. Some planters chafed at this dependence. They sought ways to break free, to establish direct trade with other markets, to reduce their reliance on British credit. But British laws restricted colonial trade, required that most goods pass through British ports, limited options for planters who wanted to escape the system. The Navigation Acts passed in the 17th century required that colonial goods be shipped in British vessels, that certain goods be sold only to British buyers. Tobacco was among these enumerated goods, required to go first to Britain before re-export to other markets. This added costs, reduced prices, enriched British merchants at planter expense. Planters complained, but could not change the laws. They had no representation in Parliament, no voice in making the rules that governed their trade. They grumbled, evaded when possible, accepted the system because they had no choice. The same planters who complained about British restrictions imposed their own restrictions on others. They controlled local government, sat on county courts, served in the House of Burgesses. They made laws that protected their interests, that kept power in their hands, that ensured the continuation of the systems that enriched them. Their power came from land and labor. Land gave them wealth. Labor gave them production. Together, land and labor made them masters of everything they surveyed. They built houses that grew larger over generations, imported furniture and books and clothing from England, sent sons to be educated there. They created a society modeled on English gentry, but adapted to Virginia conditions. That society was hierarchical. At the top, great planters who owned thousands of acres and hundreds of slaves. Below them, smaller planters who owned less land and fewer slaves. Below them, yeoman farmers who owned no slaves, worked their own land, lived modestly. Below them, indentured servants and enslaved people who owned nothing, not even themselves. The hierarchy was not rigid. Some men rose from modest beginnings to become great planters through luck, marriage, good management. Others fell from wealth to poverty through misfortune, bad decisions, changing markets. But most remained where they began, living lives determined by circumstances they could not control. Women in this society had fewer options. They could marry, manage households, bear children. Some ran plantations when husbands died, showing competence that surprised men who had underestimated them. But they could not vote, hold office, participate directly in government. Their influence was indirect, exercised through husbands and sons and brothers. Enslaved women had even fewer options. They worked in fields alongside men, bore children who became property of their owners, faced separation from families through sale at any moment. They maintained what family life they could, passed down what they remembered of African cultures, resisted in ways large and small. The plantations where they lived were small worlds, isolated from each other by distance and poor roads. Enslaved people on one plantation might never meet those on another, might marry within the same community, might spend their entire lives on the same ground. Their world was bounded by their owner's land, by the fields they worked, by the quarters where they slept. Christmas brought brief respite from labor. A few days of rest, extra food, sometimes permission to visit other plantations. Enslaved people gathered, celebrated as they could, maintained traditions brought from Africa or developed in America. The holidays passed quickly. Work resumed. The tobacco cycle governed all. Planting in spring, cultivation through summer, harvest in fall, processing through winter. The work was never done. There was always more to do. The crop demanded constant attention, constant labor, constant sacrifice. When the crop failed, everyone suffered. Planters lost income. Enslaved people lost hope. The community tightened, waiting for better seasons, praying for rain or sun as conditions required. Seasons passed. Years passed. Generations passed. The plantation system continued, adapting to changing conditions, surviving wars and recessions and social upheavals. It would continue until something stronger broke it. That something would be civil war, decades in the future. But in the early years of Virginia, no one could imagine that. They could only imagine more of what already was: more tobacco, more land, more slaves, more wealth for those at the top. The river carried tobacco ships to England, carried manufactured goods back to Virginia. The cycle continued. The colony grew. The future remained hidden. Jamestown's church tower still stands, or part of it does. The brick structure built in the 17th century lost its roof long ago, lost its walls, lost most of what made it a church. But the tower remains, visible from the river, marking where the original settlement stood. Around it, archaeologists have excavated the remains of earlier structures. The first fort, the first church, the first storehouses, all left traces in the soil. Post holes mark where walls stood. Trash pits hold what people threw away. Graves hold what they kept. The dead in those graves were buried without markers, their names lost, their stories forgotten. They were the first settlers, the ones who died before records were kept, before anyone thought to write down who they were. They lie in ground that was once contested, then settled, then abandoned, then excavated. Archaeologists study their bones for what they reveal about health, diet, cause of death. They find evidence of malnutrition, of disease, of violence. They find signs of the starving time, of the desperation that drove people to eat what should not be eaten. The dead cannot speak, but their bones speak for them, telling stories they could not tell in life. The stories are not happy. They are stories of struggle, of suffering, of survival against odds that seemed impossible. The living who visit Jamestown now walk above these bones, read the interpretive signs, take photographs. They do not think much about the dead beneath their feet. The dead are distant, abstract, historical. They are not real in the way the living are real. But the dead were real once. They breathed, ate, slept, feared, hoped. They came across an ocean to a place they did not understand, to face dangers they could not imagine. They died here, in this swampy place, far from everything they had known. Their graves are not marked. Their names are not recorded. Their stories are lost except for what bones can tell. They are the foundation on which everything else was built. The tower stands above them, brick and mortar, built by survivors who came after. It has stood for centuries, through storms and fires and neglect. It will stand for centuries more, probably, maintained now by those who understand its significance. But significance is something the living assign. The dead do not care about significance. They are beyond caring. They are only bones, only dust, only memory fading into nothing. The river flows past, carrying water to the bay, carrying sediment that was once the land. The sediment settles where the current slows, building new land where old land has washed away. The process continues, oblivious to human concerns. Night settles over the tower, over the graves, over the river. The dead are quiet. The living sleep. The story continues somewhere else, in some other place, at some other time. But here, now, there is only night and quiet and the slow movement of water toward the sea. The tobacco fields are gone from this place. The plantations are gone. The enslaved people who worked them are gone. Only the land remains, changed by what was done to it, bearing scars that do not show. The scars are in the soil, in the pollen preserved in sediment, in the bones buried beneath. They are in the memory of descendants who carry what their ancestors endured. They are in the institutions that grew from this ground, the laws and customs and assumptions that shape lives still. Jamestown was the beginning. Not the only beginning, but one beginning. The place where certain things started, where certain patterns were set, where certain choices were made. Those choices echo still, through centuries, through generations, through all that came after. The night is long. The river is wide. The dead are many. The living carry what the dead left behind, whether they know it or not. The story continues because stories always continue, passing from one generation to the next, changing in the telling but never ending. There is no conclusion here. There is only continuation. The river flows. The night deepens. The listener drifts. The words continue, if only for a while longer, if only until sleep takes them away from all of this. Then the words continue without them, waiting for someone else to hear, waiting for the next listener to arrive. The tower stands in darkness. The graves lie undisturbed. The river moves toward morning. And somewhere, in the space between sleeping and waking, the past remains present, waiting to be remembered. The James River winds through Tidewater, Virginia, brown and wide, moving with the slow patience of water that has traveled far. It carries sediment from upstream, from rains that wash soil into tributaries, from banks that crumble into current. The sediment settles where the river meets the bay, building land that did not exist when the first settlers arrived. The colonists who landed here did not understand this river. They did not know its tides, its floods, its seasonal changes. They learned through experience, through boats that grounded on shoals, through wharves that washed away, through crops that drowned when water rose unexpectedly. They learned that the river was brackish, fresh water mixing with salt from the bay, unfit for drinking at certain times and places. They dug wells, found water that made them sick, learned that what looked clean could carry death. They learned slowly, through illness and death, through watching others sicken and die. The river taught them. It taught them that survival required attention, required respect for forces they could not control. It taught them that the land they had claimed was not passive, not empty, not waiting to be shaped. It had its own rhythms, its own requirements, its own demands. They adapted. They built wharves that could withstand tides. They planted crops that could tolerate brackish water. They moved settlements to higher ground when floods came. They learned what the river required and tried to meet those requirements. But the river required more than they could give. It required that they understand its nature, that they accept its power, that they live within its limits. They could not do this entirely. They were Europeans, accustomed to controlling landscapes, to reshaping environments to suit their needs. The river resisted this reshaping. It continued to flow as it had always flowed, indifferent to their plans. The forests taught them too. The forests that covered the coastal plain were not like European forests. They were dense, tangled, filled with species unknown in England. They sheltered animals unfamiliar to European hunters. They grew in patterns that did not match European expectations. The colonists learned to clear this forest, to cut trees and burn undergrowth, to create fields where crops could grow. They learned that cleared land lost fertility quickly, that tobacco exhausted soil within a few years, that they had to keep clearing more forest to maintain production. They learned that the forest resisted. It grew back when fields were abandoned, sending up saplings that became trees, reclaiming what had been taken. It required constant attention, constant labor, constant effort to keep it at bay. The indigenous people had managed this forest for millennia. They burned undergrowth to improve hunting, cleared fields for planting, let fields lie fallow to recover. They worked with the forest, not against it, shaping it to their needs while allowing it to continue. The English did not understand this management. They saw forest as obstacle, as resource to be consumed, as something to be replaced with European-style agriculture. They cleared and planted and moved on, leaving exhausted land behind. The forest grew back differently, changed by what had been done to it, bearing scars that would last for centuries. The game taught them too. Deer, turkey, bear, all provided food for colonists who knew how to hunt them. But hunting required knowledge of animal behavior, of migration patterns, of the signs that indicated where game could be found. The colonists learned from indigenous hunters, from observation, from trial and error. They learned that game became scarce as settlement expanded, that animals retreated before the advance of clearing and planting. They learned that they could not rely on hunting alone, that they had to raise their own food, that the abundance they had expected was not infinite. The soil taught them. The sandy coastal soil was not the rich loam they had imagined. It grew tobacco well for a few years, then declined. It required fertilizer, rotation, rest. It required management that planters were slow to learn. They learned by watching their crops fail. They learned by seeing neighbors lose their land. They learned by trial and error, by success and failure, by the slow accumulation of experience that could not be hurried. The climate taught them. Summers were hotter than English summers, winters colder, springs and falls unpredictable. Crops planted at English times failed. Diseases carried by mosquitoes and contaminated water killed those not adapted to local conditions. They learned to plant later, to harvest earlier, to store food against winter. They learned which crops thrived and which failed. They learned that survival required adaptation, required abandoning English ways for Virginia ways, required becoming something they had not been. This learning took generations. It took deaths, failures, bankruptcies, abandonments. It took the slow accumulation of knowledge passed from those who survived to those who came after. The colony survived because some learned and passed on what they learned. The indigenous people had learned all this long before. They knew the river, the forest, the game, the soil, the climate. They knew when to plant, when to hunt, when to move, when to stay. They had learned through centuries of living in this place, through generations of observation and adaptation. The English did not ask them. They did not seek their knowledge, did not value what they knew, did not recognize that survival depended on understanding they did not possess. They learned on their own, slowly and painfully, making mistakes that cost lives. Some individuals learned from indigenous neighbors. John Smith learned, traded, asked questions. Others traded for food, observed planting techniques, adopted indigenous crops. But the colony as a system did not learn. It continued to assume European superiority, continued to act as if English ways were the only ways, continued to suffer for its assumptions. The river flows past all of this, past the learning and the failure, past the deaths and the survivals. It does not care. It only flows. The ground at Jamestown holds layers. Below the colonial remains are indigenous remains, traces of people who lived here for thousands of years before Europeans arrived. Projectile points, pottery fragments, hearths where fires burned. The evidence is there for those who know how to find it. Above the colonial remains are modern remains, tourist trash, construction debris, the detritus of visitors who come to see where America began. The layers accumulate, one on another, building a record of human presence that archaeologists will someday read. The river moves, shifting channels, eroding banks, depositing sediment. Some layers wash away, carried downstream to settle elsewhere. Others remain, buried under what comes after. The record is incomplete, fragmentary, full of gaps where the river has taken what it wanted. The people who lived here, indigenous and colonial and modern, all contributed to these layers. They left behind what they used, what they broke, what they threw away. They left behind their bones, their tools, their trash. They left behind evidence of how they lived and how they died. The archaeologists dig carefully, recording each layer, each artifact, each bit of evidence. They try to read what the ground holds, to understand what happened here, to reconstruct lives that left no written records. They work slowly, patiently, knowing that the ground holds more than they can ever recover. The ground holds stories. Stories of people who lived and died, who loved and hated, who worked and rested, who hoped and feared. Stories of children who played where now tourists walk, of mothers who buried babies in unmarked graves, of fathers who died trying to feed families. These stories are not written in books. They are written in bone and pottery and seed and pollen. They are written in the shape of post holes, in the patterns of trash disposal, in the chemistry of soil where fires burned. They are written in the ground itself, waiting to be read. Night at Jamestown covers all of this. The river reflects stars. The wind moves through trees. The ground holds its secrets, waiting for morning, waiting for archaeologists, waiting for anyone who might want to know what happened here. The living who visit during the day walk above these secrets. They read signs, take photos, buy souvenirs. They do not think much about what lies beneath their feet. They do not consider the layers of history they are walking on. They see only what is visible, only what has been reconstructed, only what the present chooses to show. The past is patient. It waits. It knows that the present will become past, that today's visitors will someday be layers in the ground, that their bones will be excavated by future archaeologists who wonder how they lived. The past waits for that, waits for its turn to be discovered, waits for its stories to be read. The river continues its work. It erodes, deposits, shifts, changes. It carries sediment from upstream, from places where rain falls on fields that were once forest, from banks that crumble into current. It carries this sediment downstream, toward the bay, toward the ocean, toward places where it will settle and become new land. The land changes. The river changes.
The people change.
Only the process continues, the slow movement of water and soil and time, shaping and reshaping, building and eroding, creating and destroying. Jamestown is part of this process. It is not separate from it, not protected from it, not permanent within it. It is as temporary as everything else, as subject to change as the riverbanks that crumble into current. But for now, it remains. The tower stands. The graves hold their dead. The reconstructions invite visitors. The story continues to be told. The night deepens. The river flows. The dead sleep. The living sleep elsewhere, in houses built on land that was once forest, in beds that were once trees, in rooms that hold their own layers of history. Morning will come. Visitors will return. The river will continue its work. The ground will hold its secrets. And somewhere, someone who heard this narration will remember it, will think of Jamestown, will wonder what it was like to be there when the first settlers landed and looked at this river and did not understand what they were seeing. That wondering is enough. It does not need resolution. It does not need ending. It only needs continuation, the slow ongoing of attention that keeps the past present, that keeps the story alive, that keeps the connection between then and now. The river flows. The night continues. The listener drifts toward sleep, carried by words that require nothing in return. That is enough. That has always been enough. The plantations spread inland from the rivers, following the tobacco economy into the Virginia interior. Each waterway became a highway, carrying hogsheads to inspection stations, carrying manufactured goods back to planters who depended on English imports. The rivers determined where settlement could go, which land could be developed, which families would prosper. The James River plantations stretched for miles along both banks. Each had its own wharf, its own landing, its own access to the water that connected them to the world beyond. The great houses sat on rises above the river, positioned to catch breezes, to survey the fields, to display the wealth of their owners. These houses grew over generations. A planter might build a modest frame structure, then add wings as his family expanded, then replace it entirely with brick when his son inherited. The architecture recorded the accumulation of wealth, the passage of time, the establishment of families that would dominate Virginia politics for centuries. Inside these houses, life followed patterns established in England but adapted to Virginia conditions. Meals were served at hours that suited plantation work. Rooms were arranged to capture whatever breeze moved through the hot summers. Furniture was imported or made locally, reflecting tastes that mixed English fashion with colonial practicality. The women who managed these households supervised enslaved servants, directed the preservation of food, oversaw the production of cloth and clothing. They kept gardens, tended poultry, cared for children. Their work was constant, never finished, essential to the functioning of the plantation. The children of these households grew up surrounded by enslaved people. They learned to give orders before they learned to read. They absorbed assumptions about race and status that would shape their entire lives. They played with enslaved children until age differences made such play impossible, then became masters of people they had once called friends. The enslaved children they played with learned different lessons. They learned that their bodies were not their own, that their families could be broken, that their futures held nothing but labor. They learned to hide what they felt, to appear content when they were not, to survive in a world that denied their humanity. The quarters where enslaved people lived were separate from the great house, hidden from view, out of sight of visitors who might be disturbed by evidence of how plantation wealth was produced. Cabins of wood or brick, small and crowded, furnished with whatever could be gathered or made. Families lived in these spaces, loved and lost, hoped and despaired. The work in tobacco fields began before dawn and continued after dusk during planting and harvest seasons. Men, women, children all labored together, hands moving through tasks that never ended. The work was physical, exhausting, damaging to bodies over years of repetition. Some enslaved people worked in the house rather than the fields. Cooks, maids, drivers, artisans with specialized skills. These positions brought better conditions but also closer surveillance, less privacy, more direct contact with owners whose moods could change without warning. The drivers, themselves enslaved, enforced discipline in the fields. They carried whips, reported resistance, maintained order for owners who could not be everywhere. Their position was ambiguous, privileged and despised, caught between worlds. The plantation system depended on violence. Whippings, separations, sales, all were tools used to control populations that had no reason to cooperate. The threat of violence was always present, always understood, always shaping behavior. Some enslaved people ran away. They headed for swamps, for forests, for places where they might find others who had escaped. They headed for Spanish Florida, where freedom was possible. They headed anywhere away from the plantations that held them. Most were caught. Advertisements in newspapers described runaways, offered rewards, warned that others should not harbor them. Patrols searched roads, checked passes, returned escapees to owners who made examples of them. Some succeeded. Maroon communities formed in remote areas, hidden from colonial authority, maintaining themselves through hunting and farming and occasional trade with sympathetic outsiders. These communities lasted for years sometimes, surviving until discovered and destroyed. The tobacco continued to grow through all of this. The leaves were harvested, cured, packed into hogsheads, rolled to wharves, loaded onto ships, carried to England. The cycle repeated season after season, year after year, generation after generation. The wealth it generated accumulated in the hands of planters who used it to buy more land, more slaves, more influence. They built churches, endowed schools, supported institutions that reflected their values and protected their interests. They created a society that served them, that justified them, that made their dominance seem natural and inevitable. The contradictions of this society were apparent to those who looked. The same men who spoke of liberty held others in bondage. The same churches that preached salvation accepted slavery. The same laws that protected property defined people as property. But few looked. Most accepted what they had been taught, what they had always known, what everyone around them believed. The system reproduced itself through custom and assumption, through the weight of tradition, through the difficulty of imagining anything different. The river carried all of this forward. It carried tobacco to ships, carried ships to England, carried English goods back to Virginia. It carried the products of enslaved labor to markets that paid for them, completing the circuit that made the system work. The river did not judge. It only flowed. The plantations along the James produced not just tobacco but also wheat, corn, livestock, timber. Planters diversified as tobacco prices fluctuated, as markets changed, as they learned that dependence on a single crop was dangerous. They raised cattle, hogs, sheep. They grew food for their own use and for sale in local markets. This diversification reduced risk. If tobacco prices fell, planters could survive on food sales, on timber, on whatever else they could produce. They became more self-sufficient, less dependent on English imports, more capable of weathering economic storms. The enslaved population grew with the diversification. More crops required more labor. More land required more workers. The enslaved population reproduced itself, births exceeding deaths, so that Virginia became a net exporter of enslaved people to other regions as the tobacco economy expanded westward. Families were broken by this export trade. Children sold away from parents, spouses separated, communities dispersed. The domestic slave trade moved people from Virginia to Kentucky, Tennessee, Mississippi, Alabama, wherever new lands were opening for cotton cultivation. The enslaved people who remained in Virginia worked the same fields their parents had worked, lived in the same quarters, attended the same churches. They maintained what family connections they could, knowing that any day could bring separation. The planters who sold them justified the trade as economic necessity. They needed cash, needed to reduce debt, needed to respond to market conditions. They did not see themselves as breaking families, as destroying lives. They saw themselves as managing their affairs. The enslaved people saw differently. They saw children taken, spouses lost, parents left behind. They saw the system that claimed to provide for them exposed as what it was, a machine for extracting labor and producing profit, indifferent to human connection. Some planters tried to keep families together. They sold to local buyers, arranged for families to go together, resisted the pressure to maximize profit at human expense. But the system pushed against such choices. The market rewarded those who treated enslaved people as commodities, who sold when prices were high, who moved labor to where it was most valuable. The pressure was constant. It came from creditors, from neighbors, from the logic of the market itself. Planters who resisted found themselves at disadvantage, unable to compete with those who accepted the system's requirements. The enslaved people developed their own culture within these constraints. They created families, raised children, maintained traditions brought from Africa or developed in America. They adapted Christianity to their own purposes, finding in biblical stories of exodus and liberation hope that sustained them. They sang songs that carried coded messages, that expressed feelings they could not speak openly, that connected them to each other across the distances between plantations. They gathered for worship in secret, in places where owners could not observe, where they could be themselves without performance. They told stories, passed down knowledge, maintained memory of ancestors and places and times before captivity. They kept alive what the system tried to erase, preserving connection to past and hope for future. The system could not erase everything. It could not prevent love, could not prevent hope, could not prevent the human capacity to find meaning in circumstances designed to deny it. The enslaved people proved this every day, in every small act of resistance, in every moment of connection, in every choice to continue living when living was so hard. The river witnessed all of this. It saw the ships arriving with enslaved people from Africa. It saw the ships departing with tobacco grown by their labor. It saw the families formed and broken, the work done and done again, the lives lived and ended. The river does not speak. It only flows. The great houses along the James still stand, some of them. Berkeley, Westover, Shirley, names that carry centuries of history. They have been preserved, restored, open to visitors who come to see how the planter elite lived. The quarters where enslaved people lived are mostly gone. A few have been reconstructed, interpreted, marked with signs that tell visitors what happened there. But most have vanished, their locations forgotten, their stories lost. The fields where tobacco grew are now planted with other crops, or covered with suburban development, or returned to forest. The landscape has changed, shaped by forces the planters could not have imagined. But the river remains. It flows past the great houses, past the sites of quarters, past the fields and forests and developments. It carries sediment from upstream, from places where rain falls on ground that was once plantation land. It carries memory, if memory can be carried by water. The descendants of planters live scattered across the country, many of them unaware of what their ancestors did, of how their family wealth was accumulated. Some know, some care, some try to reckon with the past. Most go about their lives, inheriting benefits they do not question. The descendants of enslaved people live scattered too. Some remain in Virginia, in communities that trace back to plantation times. Others moved north during the Great Migration, seeking opportunities denied them in the South. Still others spread across the country, carrying DNA and memory and the marks of what their ancestors endured. They meet sometimes, descendants of planters and descendants of enslaved, at reunions and conferences and chance encounters. They look at each other across distances that centuries have not closed. They try to find words for what connects them, for what separates them, for what the past requires of them now. The river flows past all of this. It does not care about reunions or reckonings. It only flows, carrying water to the bay, carrying sediment to the sea, carrying whatever it carries without judgment. Night on the James is quiet. The great houses are dark. The sites of quarters are overgrown. The river reflects stars that have watched all of this, that will watch whatever comes after. The water moves, patient and slow, as it has always moved. The listener drifts toward sleep, carried by words that have no ending, by stories that continue beyond any telling. The river flows in imagination as it flows in fact, connecting past and present, carrying memory forward into darkness. There is no conclusion here. There is only continuation. The river flows. The night deepens. The words continue, if only for a while longer, if only until sleep takes them away. Then the words continue without the listener, waiting for someone else to hear, waiting for the next night to come. The plantations are quiet now. The fields are empty. The quarters are silent. Only the river moves. Only the water speaks. Only the current carries what remains toward the sea. The sea receives everything eventually. The river's water, the sediment, the memory, the forgetting, all flows down to the ocean, to the great body that holds all rivers, that receives all endings, that waits beyond everything. But the river has not reached the sea yet. It still flows through Virginia, through tidewater, through places where history happened. It still carries what it carries. It still moves toward morning. The listener sleeps. The river flows. The night continues. The story does not end because the story cannot end. It only pauses, waiting for the next telling, waiting for the next listener, waiting for the next night when someone will hear these words and drift toward sleep as others have done before. That is enough. That has always been enough. The river knows this. The night knows this. The words know this. And now the listener knows it too, carried toward sleep by water and darkness and the slow ongoing of what cannot be concluded.